I'm kind of overwhelmed. I'm overwhelmed by the generosity of the college to make this possible. I'm overwhelmed by the generosity of my colleagues, especially Andrew and Catherine, who must have essentially had a whole other job. When this started, it was kind of like the Mickey Rooney movie, Let's Get Together and Put on a Play. And the presumption was in 5 minutes we would have the product, and that turned out not to be quite true. And no matter what burden arose, no matter what obstacle appeared, they found ways to solve every problem with great cheer and good grace to make this day possible. And it really has, I just can't put into words what it has meant to me. In addition, it has been a Rashomon-like day. Do you all know what I'm referring to? Even those of you who haven't started shaving yet? So Rashomon is this movie about different people who all witness the same scene and see very different scenes. Well, what I have heard today depicted is pieces of my life that I find close to unrecognizable, because even though they all happened, my interpretation of them is dramatically different from the interpretations that you have been given. You've been given the impression from everybody that I somehow had this incredible influence on the work and life of the people with whom I have collaborated. I've been the teacher. My own take on these collaborations, and I mean this with complete sincerity, is exactly the reverse. All I can see in these interactions is the ways in which each of these people have taught me things that I didn't already know. I came to Swarthmore remarkably ignorant, although I didn't think I was, and the interactions I've had with colleagues, many of whom you've heard, have educated me. And I feel like I have learned a lot more from them than I've taught them. So I think basically they've been telling you a lie. And I'm going to try to sort of straighten that out. But occasions like this encourage people to look back. Nostalgia, is a nice thing if indulged in extremely small doses, sort of like hallucinogens. So I think I have permission to indulge in a little bit of nostalgia. But I'm going to do it because I want to make a point. I don't have a low opinion of myself. I really don't. But as I look back on the most impactful, formative, meaningful, and rewarding experiences of my career, almost all of them without exception were the result of extraordinary good fortune. I made the most of my opportunities, but I had little or nothing to do with creating any of those opportunities. They smacked me in the face, and I take credit for recognizing that they were opportunities, but not for creating the conditions that made those opportunities possible. It's apparent to me that I teach classes in decision-making, where ostensibly part of the point is to teach people how to make good decisions, and wisdom, which ostensibly part of the point of which is to teach people how to make good decisions. But it's apparent to me that virtually none of the important decisions that I have made in my life conform to any idea at all about what is rational or what is wise. And that's what I'm going to sort of give you a quick summary of why that's true, and then try to connect it to something that I think is actually more significant than just my idiosyncratic history. I moved to Yonkers from the Bronx in the 7th grade. Yonkers is just north of the Bronx. The Bronx is just north of Manhattan, which is where I thought civilization began. I thought it ended in Brooklyn. Apparently that's changed. So I moved in 7th grade. Almost immediately, I met Myrna. You have heard Myrna mentioned several times. Many of you know her. Not all of you do. I would like it if Myrna and also our older daughter, Allison, and our oldest granddaughter, Ruby, stood up and faced the crowd. They differ principally on the basis of age and height. So I met Myrna almost immediately, and she essentially immediately became my best friend. Then she became my girlfriend, which took a lot of work on my part. And then she became my wife and the mother of my children. She's always been my toughest and my most sympathetic critic. Every time I give her something to read, her aim is to find a way to help me make it better, to find a way to help me say what she knows I'm trying to say, that the first pass hasn't been eloquent enough to make clear, and this is true even when she disagrees with me sometimes. So she's always been my sounding board with the exception of this talk, and that actually scares the crap out of me. So anyway, she became my best friend, and the question is why? Was it because I was a rational decision maker? Did I see how intelligent she was? Did I see how empathetic she was? Did I see how kind she was? Did I see the fierce moral core that kind of defined her existence in the world? The answer is no. No to all of those things. I was attracted to her, this is the God's honest truth, because she was the first girl I had ever met who loved baseball. And more specifically, loved the New York Yankees. So, the one marriage that everyone is bragging about that I have had, and I'm willing to take credit. That's a real achievement. But I had it because she liked the damn Yankees. She liked Mickey Mantle. What kind of reason is that to form a life partnership? So we went through school together, and I applied to college. I applied to 6 colleges. I assure you I applied on the basis of zero information. The school I was dying to go to was Columbia because I went to a gathering of high school newspaper editors there and completely fell in love. It was my romantic image of what a college should be. I knew nothing about what it was actually like to be a student there. I applied to 6 colleges, and I got into 1. It's true. The only place that took me was NYU, which had a little Swarthmore-like campus in the Bronx, and so I cleverly decided to go. I'm willing to take a fair amount of credit for that decision. So I took psychology as a freshman, and I didn't have any idea what psychology was. I don't even mean that I thought psychology was Freud. If I had known that much, I would have been sophisticated. I knew nothing about what psychology was. It fit into my schedule. I know that no Swarthmore student would ever choose a course for that reason. So anyway, my Psych 1 teacher was a guy named Phil Zimbardo. You've heard his name mentioned already once. Those of you who don't know about him, he's a legendary Psych 1 teacher. Probably a third of the students he taught ended up wanting to do something connected to psychology, and he completely captivated me. And so I went from being a complete ignoramus about psychology to being a huge fan of psychology, but that wasn't enough. My aspiration still was to be a writer. And I took another course that used to be required, freshman English composition, which was designed to teach you how to write. And the first papers I turned in this course, I got D's. This is sort of the drill. They give you low grades at the beginning to basically humiliate you, and so that you think you actually still have something to learn, and gradually your grades go up even if your writing doesn't get any better. But I didn't know that. So what did I learn? I learned psychology is incredibly exciting, and I don't have what it takes to be a writer. And if I hadn't had both of those experiences, the odds are pretty good I would not have pursued psychology. So I don't think I deserve a whole lot of credit for that. These were the circumstances that confronted me. So I started taking psychology, and Zimbardo's not the only star. There's another star in the department Some of you may be familiar with him. His name is Alan Schneider. He taught me psychology. He taught Myrna psychology. Myrna spent 2 years working in his lab, and then we recruited him to come to Swarthmore when the NYU campus that he taught at and I studied at closed. So that's how I became a psychology major. Time came to go to graduate school. I only applied to 2, and I had no interest in one of them. So I got into the other one, and I went to the other one, and it happened to be Penn. I chose Penn for the wrong reasons. I won't tell you what the reasons were because I don't want to insult people, but I chose Penn on the basis of bad reasons, but it turned out it was a spectacularly good decision because of the unbelievably vibrant, alive, big question-oriented atmosphere that was present there when I started. Psychology was in a period of turmoil in the late 60s and early 70s. There were these received truths that psychologists thought they understood, and all of them were being turned upside down, and everyone there was open to changing their view of what was important, what was interesting, and what knowledge counted as. This was a tiny window of time. Psychology was closed-minded before. Psychology has become awfully closed-minded after. But in the period in the early 1970s, it seemed as though everything was possible. And I happened to be at the most intellectually engaged institution in the country at exactly the moment when the people there were as intellectually engaged as it was possible to be. None of this had anything to do with any rational decision I made. I was smart enough to appreciate it. I was certainly not smart enough to make it happen. Nonetheless, even though Penn was exciting, I was doing this ridiculous work teaching pigeons how to do stuff in little boxes. And the world, for those of you who aren't aware of it, the world was falling apart in the 1960s, or at least it seemed to be. And there was some hope that the next world would be a lot better. And I decided that I was really doing something that was essentially akin to intellectual masturbation when I could be out there doing something that improved the world. So I decided to go to law school. And I talked to the folks at Penn about starting law school part-time while I finished my PhD. And at the end of 2 years, I'd have a year's worth of law school and a year's worth of and I'd have my PhD done. But the plan was to go get a law degree and then defend political radicals from oppression by the police and other oppressive agents of the state. That was the plan. But Penn said full-time or nothing. And so I said to myself, all right, I will rush and finish my PhD and then start law school full-time. And that's what I did, and that was the plan. And in that year, as has been mentioned, I TA'd in a Psych 1 class taught by Marty Seligman. And I discovered something that I had been completely oblivious to while being in graduate school, which is that a significant part of what one can do as an academic is teaching. And even if putting animals in boxes is frivolous beyond belief, teaching students is anything but frivolous. And it transformed my aspirations for myself when I appreciated that I could conceivably have some hand in changing the world by continuing on the path that I was on. I wish I could say that I knew in advance that this was possible. I didn't. It was an accidental discovery that I was clever enough to appreciate when it smacked me in the face. But my good fortune doesn't end there. Myrna was a graduate student a little bit behind me in progress. We were going to have the two-body problem if I applied for jobs. And it turned out that a good friend of mine named Joe Bernheim, who taught at Swarthmore College, decided that he also couldn't stand spending his life putting animals in boxes and watching them do silly things for food. So he quit to go to medical school. He quit Swarthmore to go to medical school, and a job opened up. When did the job open up? Exactly when I was ready to apply for it. And so I applied for the job. Did I think it was the best possible job? I didn't think. What I kind of thought was, it is a good enough job. Swarthmore is. Swarthmore is a good place. I knew that it was a good place. It was such a good place that I didn't apply because I knew I'd never get in. So I applied for this job and only this job, and I got it. And so it is true not only that this is the only job I've ever had, it's the only job I have ever applied for. And that probably makes me close to unique. So it was only several years after I was there that I discovered not that Swarthmore was a good gig, but that for me, it was the perfect gig. It was the perfect job. It was the job designed with me in mind. I sure as hell didn't know this in advance, but I was clever enough to see it when it became apparent to me. I, as you've heard various people exaggerate, I'm a lover of ideas. I'm more an experimental philosopher than I am an experimental psychologist, as my colleagues in the psychology department will almost certainly tell you. And Swarthmore not only allowed that, it encouraged it. It encouraged me to talk, to operate at a level of idea and abstraction, and not only at a level of empirical laboratory detail. So I was able to cultivate what was for me the natural and fulfilling approach to studying the things that I was interested in. There's virtually no place else in the country that I could have done this kind of work in this kind of way without paying a very significant price. At Swarthmore, not only do you not pay a price, you actually get all kinds of accolades showered on you for seeing the big as opposed to the small picture. But in addition, as Schuldenfrei told you earlier, I was teaching a class on Skinner, and Schuldenfrei was teaching a class on Skinner. Mine was actually based on what Skinner actually said. Schuldenfrei's was based on what Skinner would have said if Skinner had been a little bit more consistent and self-aware than he was. But there were these two students, these two wonderful, interested and interesting students, Kathy Purcell and Nancy Sato, and they were taking both of our classes, and they would go to his class and hear X, and they would go to my class and hear not X, and then they'd go to his class and hear Y, and they'd go to mine and hear not Y, and they couldn't stand it anymore. And they finally said, listen, you two have to talk to each other. And we did. And it began a conversation that's now 45 years old. It has been thrilling all the way through, and occasionally not only thrilling, but also productive. I think I don't mean this facetiously, I think that the sort of deep approach that I have taken to my work in the last 35 years is more influenced by the interactions that I've had with Richie and Hugh Lacey than pretty much anything else. Ken Sharp described some of this in detail, and so did Hazel Marcus. The idea that human nature is something that is shaped, not essential, came out of my interactions with Schuldenfrei and Lacey, and they got it largely from their reading of Marx. So it transformed my life to be able to work with these people, but it happened only because there were two aggressive, interested, and interesting students who demanded that we leave our damn offices once in a while and talk to one another. Several years later, I was on sabbatical at Harvard, and I was taking classes in economics and evolutionary biology, and my plan was just to teach a course in this stuff. That was my only plan. I had no grander aspirations. And Dan Riesberg, who you've heard from this morning, invited me to give a talk at the New School. I'm sure Dan doesn't remember this. Maybe Dan does. And I decided that instead of giving my usual talk about pigeons and boxes, I would actually sit down and think about what I'd been studying this year and give a talk about the relation between economics, psychology, and evolutionary biology. So I started sort of organizing my notes, and when I was done, it was 150 pages long. So I did not give a 150-page colloquium, but I did decide maybe this should be a book. It had never occurred to me to write a book on this, but I had basically written 2/3 of a book. So I submitted it to my publisher, and that became The Battle for Human Nature. It was certainly not anything I designed, and once again, I was clever enough to recognize the opportunity when it smacked me in the face. It was the first real book I wrote. I don't count textbooks as books. Marty Seligman invited me to this gathering of young and less young people to launch positive psychology in Mexico, and we took turns talking about some of the things we were working on, and I gave a talk about choice and its the downside of too much choice, and Marty made a casual remark that I'm sure he doesn't remember having made. He said, "I'll bet that's not true of everybody." It had never occurred to me to ask myself that question. It launched what became the research that Andrew and John and Sonia and Darren and I did, identifying people who want the best versus people who want good enough, and making the argument that the choice problem is really only a problem for people who have these absurdly high standards and always need to get the best out of every decision. A casual remark made by Marty is what launched that whole line of work. I didn't plan it, I didn't engineer it, I didn't rationally construct it. All I did was take advantage of a good idea when somebody smacked me in the face with it. So that's sort of how my life has gone. I gave a talk about this work at some small conference in New York. A guy came up to me afterwards and said, I run a conference called TED. Would you like to come and talk at TED? And I said, what's TED? And he told me what it was, and I said, what the hell, that sounds like fun. So I went and gave a talk, and nobody knew what it was back then. And then a few months later, they launched this website, and YouTube got born, and all of a sudden, everybody on the planet has seen me wearing embarrassing shorts and a t-shirt. By the way, I just want to, this is a digression. I was invited back a few years later to give a talk on wisdom, and this time everybody knew what TED was, including me. And Myrna, bless her heart, gave me one piece of advice, and that was, don't you dare go there looking the way you did the last time. So I actually went there looking more like this. And you don't know what kind of effort it takes for me to dress like this. And so I gave my talk, and afterwards, 25 people came up to me and said, I was so disappointed you weren't wearing shorts. They thought this was a kind of right-on, power to the people statement. I guess one of the things this shows you is that you can't win. So my life has really been one fortunate opportunity after another. People who have known me for a long time, if you ask them, I think, and they're being honest with themselves, will tell you that the brief narrative I have given you is really the truth. I'm not trying to be falsely modest. I have been incredibly lucky and smart enough to take advantage of good luck when it has come my way. And this has made me an extremely happy person. And it's made me an extremely happy person for reasons that some of you might not appreciate, and that is, there's a wonderful paper that was published about 3 years ago asking what happiness means at different points in history and in different cultures. And the astonishing finding, it certainly astonished me, is that historically, happiness means good fortune. It doesn't mean that the emotional response to having good fortune, it means good fortune itself. A happy person is a lucky person. You understand the difference? It's not lucky people are happy. It is what it means to be happy is that you're lucky. This was the dominant definition pretty much everywhere, and what's happened in recent times is that in cultures like ours, this definition has obviously been replaced by one that is very agentic, one that focuses entirely on sort of subjective understanding, what it feels like to be you, and not what the objective circumstances of your life have been. But even now, in dictionaries that capture the language of many countries, you still see happiness as good luck as a secondary or at worst tertiary definition, and in some countries it is still the primary definition. And so I'm a happy person in the sense that I have been the beneficiary of an enormous amount of good fortune. I'm also a happy person in the sense that I appreciate that, and I tend to walk around most of the time with a smile on my face. So that's my history, but I'm not telling you my history just because this is what you're supposed to do on an occasion like this. I'm telling you this because I wanted to make a point. And my point is that I want to talk to you a little bit about justice. Somebody has already alluded to this idea too, but I'm sorry you're going to hear it again. What do we mean by justice? This has been studied. This is not the philosopher's question, what should one mean by justice? It is, what do ordinary people mean by justice when you ask ordinary people what they think justice means? And ordinary people think justice means equity. In studies done tapping the sense of justice in well over 100,000 people, they think that justice is equity. Does that tell you what justice means? Do you know what that means, that justice is equity? It doesn't tell me enough. This is true of liberals, it's true of conservatives. It doesn't seem to distinguish on the basis of political orientation. But what does equity mean? I think equity means these two sentences. That people should deserve what they get, and that people should get what they deserve. Equity is when you deserve the good things that come to you, and when you get the good things that your activity in the world warrants. This is not saying much more than that success, when we say that people should deserve what they get, we're saying that success in life should be meritocratic. We should earn our successes. It shouldn't be who you know that determines success, but what you know and what you do. It's unjust to get good seats at a concert because your brother-in-law is a concert promoter, although you'll probably take them. It's unjust to get into Yale because your mother is an alum or your grandfather made a big contribution. It's unjust to get a government contract because you made a big donation in an electoral campaign, or because your best friend is the guy who awards the contract. This standard of justice is a kind of a no-brainer. It's hard even to imagine a justification for violations of this standard. Of course, the world doesn't work this way, but the sentence is a kind of useful guide when we seek to make whatever system we work in a little more just. Can we make this sentence a little more true? It guides us to identify what's wrong and to come up with procedures to correct the injustice. What about the second sentence? Should people get what they deserve? There are a lot of concerns these days about economic inequality in the U.S., and partly what people are talking about is folks who have done the right thing. The expression you hear again and again is these are people who have, quote, worked hard and played by the rules, only to fall further and further behind. So this is a complaint that people are not getting what they deserve. The problem with this second sentence is that it establishes a standard of justice that simply can't be achieved. Students, close your ears, not every well-trained computer engineer will get a job at Microsoft, Google, or Facebook. Not every high-achieving high school senior will get into Harvard, Princeton, or Swarthmore. There is just not enough room at the top. So justice in this sense is not possible. So I've spent a fair amount of time for various reasons thinking about the justice and equity associated with college admissions, as you've heard. So how do we do when it comes to college admissions? It is true of Harvard and Princeton and Swarthmore, I think, that mostly people deserve what they get. With a few caveats like legacy admissions, I think it's true that people who get into these places deserve to get into these places. I think the careful screening that comes when you can admit less than 10% of the already self-selected group who apply almost guarantees that every student you admit will merit admission. So we have solved that problem. But does everyone get what they deserve? Well, you know the answer to that as well as I do. Those of you who are walking around with little T-shirts in your heads that say Swarthmore, but my first choice was Yale, know that not everyone can get what they deserve. A portion of the applicants to Stanford, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Amherst, and Swarthmore probably lack the qualifications to be admitted, but many applicants, probably the majority of applicants, do deserve to be admitted. It's unjust. Is it unjust that so many qualified applicants don't get in? Yes, it is. But what the hell is a school supposed to do? What ends up happening, as you all know, is that the standards for admission keep ratcheting up in an effort to be fair to the applicants and at the same time to keep institutions from exploding in size. Under these conditions, what it means to deserve to get in to Swarthmore is no longer that you're an excellent student, but that you are a more excellent student than the competition. Admissions officers have the unenviable task of making distinctions among candidates where no real distinctions exist. In doing so, they preserve the veneer of justice in college admissions. My good friend Sheldon Fry once interviewed an applicant to the college as a favor to a friend. I think usually you stay out of admissions stuff, and was incredibly impressed with this young person and sent the Dean of Admissions a note saying what a wonderful person this was, and this student did not get in. And Sheldon Fry, curious, sent a note saying, "Why? How come?" And the Dean of Admissions said, quote, "No reason." And Sheldon Fry said, quote, "What do you mean, no reason?" Did the accent as best I could. What the Dean of Admissions said is, look, there is no reason to take this person and not this person. We're trying to make distinctions that are not makeable. We do the best we can. And I think they do the best we can.
You also told me not to tell anybody.
So the good news is that this was 31 years ago, so it's no longer relevant. And you didn't tell anybody. You just told me. I'm the one who told. And as I think you know, and as it's becoming clear in more and more affluent, privileged communities around the country, this escalation of admission standards is not benign. It induces students or their parents to try to game the system, taking and retaking SATs, spending a fortune on SAT prep classes, having pros edit college essays, signing up for extracurricular activities that they have no interest in. All told, an enormous commitment of resources in money, time, and effort for no purpose other than to get into these select schools. Admissions officers are confident that they can see through these ruses, and no doubt they sometimes can. But I think they will be fooled much more often than they think. So these are the practices that get encouraged. I can't give a talk without cartoons. So this is a real problem. We seem to be stuck. How else can we pursue justice except by raising standards? I think there is a way. You've already heard it mentioned, and people who've been in my classes have heard me talk about it until they're absolutely nauseous at the thought of hearing about it again. Too bad for you. I've been arguing for this for a decade. Nobody takes me seriously. The solution to this problem is a lottery. Every applicant who is good enough, a standard that will vary from school to school, gets his or her name put into a hat, and then the winners are chosen at random. If selective schools were honest about what it takes for a student to succeed, they will have standards of good enough that are high but not unreasonable. And if they use a lottery, the pressure balloon that is engulfing high school kids and destroying them will be punctured. Just like that. Instead of having to be better than anyone else in Palo Alto, all they will have to be is good enough and lucky. Anyone who is good enough gets her name thrown into the hat and has the same chance of admission as anyone else with a name in the hat. This is the right thing to do, both because we really need to relieve pressure on high-achieving students, and because it is a fairer representation of what the admissions process actually currently is. There is a principle called the principle of a flat maximum. We are at a region of the distribution, and places like Swarthmore and Yale and Princeton and so on, we are at a region of the distribution, way at the right tip of the distribution, where the differences among the people being measured are smaller than the errors in the tools that are being used to measure them. And as long as that's true, it is in effect a lottery, whether you try to convince yourself otherwise or not. If you made it a lottery, people wouldn't beat themselves up quite so much for not getting in, and they wouldn't drive themselves crazy trying to figure out what little extra edge they could negotiate in competition with their peers. A lottery like this won't correct the injustice that is inherent in a pyramidal system in which not everyone can rise to the top, and nothing will. But here's what I think it will do. It will reveal this injustice for what it is, instead of pretending otherwise. Arguably, it will be more just than the current system, since people with financial resources are much more likely to try to game the system and succeed in the current system than people without resources. And the data that I see suggests that the income inequality among students at institutions like this is much worse than the income inequality across the nation as a whole. Selective institutions magnify income inequality rather than reducing it, despite what we say our intentions are. Under a lottery, reasons to game the system would largely evaporate. Would this decrease the quality of the students we teach? Actually, I think not. The dean of admissions at Harvard was once quoted as saying about 12 or so years ago that if they went through standard admissions and they took all the people they admitted and threw them out and then started again, nobody who teaches the students at Harvard would have any idea that they had done that. That there's no real difference between the top batch of students and the second tier of students. A case can be made that a lottery would improve the quality of students, and this speaks to the point that Amy made in her talk. When we instrumentalize what students do in high school, it makes them worse students. A lottery will make the instrumentalization of high school education much less significant than it currently is, and this will probably mean students cultivate their interests and passions to a much greater degree, and as a result are more interesting and better students than the kind we're getting now, although I have no complaints about the kind we're getting now. So why is it nobody takes this blatantly, obviously good idea seriously? My guess about why is that people think it is unjust for really important life outcomes to be decided by chance. No matter how high the standards get, people can enter the process convinced that applicants will get what they deserve. Who wants your future determined by a roll of the dice? I understand this sentiment, but I think it is doubly mistaken. It's mistaken because despite what admissions people think and say, admissions already is determined by a roll of the dice, or worse, by system gaming. And it's mistaken because I think a lottery will force people to acknowledge the importance of good fortune in virtually all life outcomes. The reason that I did this embarrassing description of my own life was to try to convince you that good fortune is the story, is a significant piece of the story of success and failure in almost all of our lives. I just chose myself as an example since I seem to be the principal topic of conversation today. But if this notion that it's all meritocracy leads people to believe that nothing is a matter of chance, everything is earned, and this leads people to be remarkably unsympathetic to other people in society who have not succeeded. If my success is because of my effort and achievement, their failure must be because of their lack of effort and their lack of achievement. So what ends up happening is you create a society, and this also speaks to Hazel's point, earlier, you create a society that is almost devoid of empathy and devoid of perspective taking, a society of people who think, since everybody gets what they deserve, my success is deserved, why should I worry at all about the people who have failed? Their failure is also deserved. I think admitting the importance of good fortune might encourage institutions themselves to be more explicit about the importance of things like empathy, compassion, and stuff, and worry a little bit less about where they rank in the U.S. News and World Report, and a little bit more about where they rank when it comes to nurturing good people. And what applies to academic success applies to success more generally. Does everybody deserve what they get? No. But I think actually, in a competitive world economy, more people who succeed deserve to succeed than used to be true. I think the world is actually getting better in that regard. But does everybody get what they deserve? No, absolutely, unequivocally not. Working hard and playing by the rules is no guarantee of anything, nor can it be. You can be doing your job, your company can be doing its job, and all can be well, and then someone, some 12-year-old, will come up with a better, cheaper, faster way to do what you do, and you'll be out of a job. That's how markets work. Just as deserving to get into Harvard has come to mean being better than all the other students, deserving to succeed in the economy has come to mean being better than all the other employees or all the other firms. Robert Frank describes this as a winner-take-all society. I think this is a pretty accurate description. Appreciating the inevitability of injustice and the centrality of good fortune might get us to ask ourselves what responsibilities we have to people who do not get what they deserve. What responsibilities do we have to stakeholders and not just shareholders when a town's dominant employer is threatening to move offshore? What responsibilities do we have to families who seem to be doing everything right only to be thrown into chaos by a serious illness? I think it's easier for us to ask these questions in an open-hearted way when we appreciate that financial success in life has much in common with admission to Harvard, that lots of deserving people will fail. And just as we want to assure a soft landing for teenagers whose envelopes from admissions offices are thin, we want to assure them the possibility of an excellent education somewhere else. So too, we want to assure people who lose the market competition that they will still be able to lead decent lives. The more that we appreciate how much our own success in life is the result of good fortune, the more open I think we'll be toward supporting people who have not been quite as fortunate as we've been. Behind what philosopher John Rawls called a veil of ignorance, where you don't know how lucky you or your children will be, you might be a bit more enthusiastic about policies that redistribute resources to favor the unlucky. So what I'm trying to suggest is that an appreciation in most people's lives, like my life, has been a series of essentially unplanned and uncontrolled opportunities that you may or may not take advantage of, will make us more sympathetic to the role of luck in life and thus more sympathetic to people whose luck has been bad. What we don't want is to create a generation of people who, to quote Molly Ivins about a president I won't name, who were born on third base and thought they hit a triple. So I take my own life as an example of two things. I deserve most of the good things that have happened to me. However, I did not deserve the good fortune that gave me the opportunities that I was clever enough to make the most of. Thank you so much for coming.